I'm David Barsamian. This edition of AR features Noam Chomsky on wars, bailouts, and elections. In the economic meltdown, the term in history is routine. For example, the biggest bailout in history, the largest bank failure in history, the greatest corporate collapse in history, and the stock market's worst week in history. And there are more in histories on the horizon because the fundamental issue is not being addressed. The so-called free market is not free. Washington has forever been intervening on behalf of corporations, sometimes with direct cash, but more often through the tax code. And don't forget all those lucrative government contracts secured by lobbyists. Can anyone see the dots, much less connect them? The political class votes for Wall Street while invoking the name of Main Street. So when banks are making money, they get to keep all of it. But when they incur losses, then taxpayers, generous and compassionate, come to their rescue. Take the $700 billion bailout, which the International Monetary Fund estimates will be twice that. Instead of buying toxic assets from the banks with taxpayer money, why not give that money directly at no or low interest to homeowners who are in danger of foreclosure? To talk about these issues is Noam Chomsky, internationally renowned MIT professor. He's been a leading voice for peace and social justice for more than 4 decades. He's in huge demand as a speaker all over the world. The New York Times calls him a global phenomenon, perhaps the most widely read voice on foreign policy on the planet. Author of scores of books, his latest are Perilous Power, The Essential Chomsky, and What We Say Goes. I talked with him in his office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts on September 10th, 2008. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be back again.
I want to ask you, of course, about the election. Given the unpopularity of Bush, the wars, and the tumbling economy, why isn't Obama way ahead of McCain?
Well, that's an interesting question. Most of the models that political scientists use predict that the Democrats should be way ahead. In fact, by and large, they are way ahead, except on the presidential vote. So you have to look for other factors. And it's, we can investigate them. One is probably race. It's well known that when people are asked on polls whether they have questions about racial prejudice, they deny that they have it. But when you see their behavior, you see that they're underestimating their own racial prejudice. Another element is class. The Republican public relations system, propaganda system, which is quite a formidable apparatus, has succeeded, as they succeeded in 2004, in portraying the Democrats, Obama, as the representative of the elitist liberals who run the world and have contempt for common folk like you and me, and their candidate is kind of like an ordinary guy. I mean, it happens, he can't remember how many houses he owns, but let's forget about that. And George Bush, a little spoiled brat who went to Yale, was kind of guy you'd like to meet in a bar and wants to go cut brush on his ranch, ordinary, simple guy. And I think they've succeeded in doing that with Obama, in making him, so he's presented as, first of all, black, secondly, somehow strange, not like one of us. Us means white, working class, American, blue eyes, and obviously not one of us. Strange, values that we don't understand. Where did he come from? And also one of those liberals who runs everything and has contempt for us. And they haven't even gotten started on the revving up their slander and vilification machine. But it's an impressive apparatus. Goebbels would be impressed. It works, and it works very well. One good example, which has been studied in some detail by Ed Herman and David Peterson, is the way they've used the Jeremiah Wright case. They have a detailed article that just came out about that, and it's striking.
Jeremiah Wright, Obama's pastor in Chicago.
I mean, this was the main story in the press for weeks, what Jeremiah Wright said. First of all, almost everything he said was quite entirely reasonable, even if it's unacceptable to mainstream ideology. But even the parts that merit criticism, like the U.S. organized AIDS to kill blacks or whatever it is, it's a marginal part of his message. And the preachers who white preachers who support McCain have said similar or worse things. So for example, who was it? Falwell and Robertson, I think, blamed 9/11 on the ACLU, gays, so on. Can you get more outrageous than that?
Pat Robertson called openly for the assassination of Hugo Chavez.
Yeah, okay. But, see, that probably is considered acceptable. But when Wright said, chickens are coming home to roost, incidentally, I think quoting an American ambassador, if I recall, that was considered horrendous. But when Falwell and Robertson say it's the ACLU and gays and so on who are responsible, the press didn't make a fuss about that. So on the one hand, there's the other thing, which is sort of in the background, is that American elections pretty systematically keep away from issues and focus on personality, character, values, what are called values, whatever that means, and pretty frank about it. McCain's campaign manager stated frankly, he said, this election is not about issues, it's about personality and character. So on the one hand, there's the way they're portraying Obama, subtext, black, Hussein, who knows who he is, and so on, pretty openly elitist liberal who owns and runs things and has contempt for America, meaning everything between the East Coast and the West Coast. On the other hand, the way they portray McCain. The press has always had a love affair with him. They've portrayed him as, first of all, a maverick, for which there's no evidence in his record. That's imagery. Also a hero and an expert in national security. See, that part is interesting, too. Let's imagine that, say, in Russia now, someone is running for office who was a pilot in the invasion of Afghanistan and was shot down while he was bombing heavily populated urban areas in Kabul, civilian areas, and was then tortured by Reagan's freedom fighters. Okay, we should sympathize with him for his fate at the hands of the people who tortured him, but would we call him a war hero and a specialist on national security? How does that make you a hero and a specialist on national security? On the other hand, that's exactly what's being done with McCain. His expertise in national security is precisely that. But you can't raise that matter here because the jingoism and commitment to the nobility of our military efforts is so high across the spectrum that you can't bring it up. And I say across the spectrum. Just recently I read a column by James Carroll in the Boston Globe. He's their kind of left pacifist, former priest, moral left critic, about McCain, which, among other things, he said that he starts off by saying McCain is a man of honor with a heroic career, and he then made an interesting comment. He said that anti-war activists felt that they had to go to McCain to apologize and sort of beg forgiveness for their opposition to the war. does some Russian who was opposed to the war in Afghanistan, does he have to go to this pilot who was shot down bombing Kabul and apologize for their opposition to the war in Afghanistan? Well, these conceptions are just foreign to Western doctrinal systems and mentality. You can't think in those terms. Just as, say, in the invasion of Iraq. Let's take the invasion of Iraq. Compare it to, say, Putin's invasion of Chechnya. Okay, I mean, there are a lot of differences, but let's compare it. The Russians invaded Chechnya, destroyed Grozny, carried out massacres, terror, and so on. But they pacified it. New York Times correspondents who've been in Chechnya recently, Chivers was there a couple months ago, report that Grozny is a booming city. There's building all over. Everybody has electricity, run by Chechens. You don't see Russian soldiers around. Do we praise Putin for his achievement? No. In fact, we condemn him for it. Suppose that Petraeus could achieve even a fraction of what Putin achieved in Chechnya. He'd probably be crowned king. Surely Obama couldn't have any objection to it. I mean, his criticism of the war is completely unprincipled. It was a strategic error. We should have put our resources elsewhere. Therefore, if the U.S. succeeds in achieving what Putin achieved in Chechnya, he ought to be applauding. Or, in fact, he's kind of silenced even at the limited achievement. That it distinguishes him sharply from his base, a lot of which had principled objections to the war. And he made sure that to tell them that he didn't really mean it. For example, by picking Biden as his vice president. Biden was one of the strongest supporters of the war in the Senate.
One thing about McCain, and maybe you can explain this, the campaign that he was participating as an Air Force pilot was called Rolling Thunder. What was that exactly?
The U.S. basically attacked South Vietnam in 1962, but it was unable to crush the resistance in South Vietnam. So by then the Johnson administration tried to put pressure on North Vietnam by bombing them. How else do you put pressure? That's Rolling Thunder. So start bombing North Vietnam to try to get them to compel the South Vietnamese guerrillas to call off their resistance. That was the basic logic behind it. It finally turned into it went up stage by stage. It's kind of interesting that if you look at we know a lot about the planning because of the Pentagon Papers and other documents that have come out. There was very meticulous planning of how to calibrate the bombing of North Vietnam. Just how far should you go? What should you bomb, and so on. The bombing of South Vietnam, even in 1965, when it was at about 3 times the level, and it stayed far higher. There's no calibration of the bombing of South Vietnam. In fact, there's almost no discussion of it. So you look at the Pentagon Papers when McNamara, Secretary of Defense at the time, approved the decision to bomb North Vietnam. There's very careful, elaborate discussion. At the very same time, he made a decision to sharply escalate the bombing of South Vietnam. Practically no mention at all. Why? Why can we bomb South Vietnam without concern? But with the bombing North Vietnam, we have to be careful to calibrate it. It was bombing North Vietnam that McCain was shot down in. Well, it's a pretty simple reason. Bombing South Vietnam's free. There's nothing they can do about it. And nobody's going to raise a fuss. In fact, even the anti-war movement didn't do much about it. It was mostly focused on the bombing of the North. So it's fair game. You can bomb without any repercussions, so we'll do whatever we like. We turn the place into a moonscape, that's fine. Bombing North Vietnam was more hazardous. There are foreign embassies in North Vietnam. There are Russian ships in the Haiphong harbor. There's a Chinese railroad that runs through North Vietnam. The way the French build railroads, one of them from southeast to southwest China happens to go through North Vietnam. So you bomb North Vietnam, you're immediately getting, it might not be cheap. Somebody might react in some fashion, so there's a cost to it. So therefore it has to be done very carefully. Bombing South Vietnam is costless, like bombing Laos, costless, therefore devastating, wipe out northern Laos, or bombing Cambodia, which is the most striking case. But there was a study that came out about 2 years ago by two Cambodia specialists, Owen Taylor and Ben Kiernan, who looked back at declassified documents from the Clinton years and discovered that the bombing of Cambodia, U.S. bombing of Cambodia, was at about 5 times the level of what was reported, and what was reported was horrendous. In fact, it was greater than the total Allied bombing in all theaters in World War II. This is bombing rural Cambodia. The bombing was on orders from Nixon, transmitted by his loyal servant Henry, who told Alexander Haig, massive bombing of Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. It's hard to find a call for genocide like that in the archival record. It went over, actually, I don't think the Taylor-Kiernan report was even reported here. I mean, I have posted it on Z, but I didn't see it anywhere else. Because who cares? I mean, for us, they also point out, Kiernan and Taylor, that the bombing basically created the Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge were a small organization nobody knew much about when it started, and it brought tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of enraged peasants to the Khmer Rouge ranks. Well, they're major events. Not a ripple here, because it's costless to us. We slaughter people in Cambodia, okay, who cares? All we can talk about is what the Khmer Rouge did after they took power. That we can talk about, because that's ideologically useful, but not this part. Well, it's kind of the same with Iraq. You see, in Iraq, the case of Iraq, they can't get away with it the way they could in Indochina. There's much more opposition by now. The world has changed. But McCain's, back to your question, Rolling Thunder was just the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and it was I think he was shot down bombing Hanoi, so it's urban areas, and that's the latter stages of the bombing. It took a while to get there. As you go away from around Hanoi, the bombing was bad, but not horrendous. It's not Dresden. As soon as you start moving away where nobody's looking, it gets much worse. By the time you get to the southern part of North Vietnam, I wasn't there, but there have been reports by authoritative witnesses. Apparently, it really is a moonscape, because there nobody was looking again, so you could do what you feel like. All of this tells us a lot, but you have to figure it out for yourself. You're not going to read it.
The inconvenient facts that Orwell talked about, and Henry being, of course, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, later Secretary of State, and Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Right. And actually, it was interesting to me that when some of the Nixon-Kissinger tapes were released over his strong objections, there was an article in the New York Times which quoted his statement, massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. It was quoted, but I didn't notice any reaction. Okay, so we're calling for genocide in rural Cambodia. Yawn. Next topic. It happened that this was going on right at the time of the Milosevic trial, and the Milosevic prosecutors were having a pretty hard time making a case. In fact, it's lucky for them that he died. They might not have been able to make a case tying him to what happened. Suppose they had found a statement like that. Suppose they'd found a statement that Milosevic had made to Serbian commanders saying anything that flies against anything that moves, trial would be over, 20 life sentences. If it was in the United States, death sentence. But in this case, which is much worse, of course, nothing. And it's against this background that you have to look at the issue of war hero, national security expert, commentator on Iraq, and so on and so forth. The picture is so skewed in the direction of jingoist nationalism that elite discussion, educated discussion, articulate discussion, can't even begin to be rational about the matter.
It's also interesting that both candidates, Obama and McCain, say the U.S. should lead the world.
Because we're so wonderful. So therefore, they don't say we should lead the world by example, by doing good things. They mean lead the world, run the world. That's the picture that, and they're not inventing it. I mean, this, in some respects, it traces back to the founding fathers. This is the only country in the world that was founded as, I think Washington's phrase was, a nascent empire. It will people the Western Hemisphere and take it over and be a light to the world and so on and so forth. But and it continues. But by World War II and since, U.S. policy has been quite explicit. Plans were formulated during World War II, high-level planners recognizing that the U.S. would emerge from the war as the world dominant power. And the plans, which were then executed and implemented and are still unchangeable, are that the United States should be the world dominant power. It should organize a world system that's conducive to U.S. interests, and it should block sovereignty by others that interferes with U.S. interests, and the core of it should be a military force. Can't quote the exact words, but that was the gist of it during World War II, and it was implemented in sophisticated ways in the years that followed. And that has been the doctrine of every president. It became pretty dramatic in 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, the pretext all those years was, well, we didn't want to do it, but we had to defend ourselves against the terrible menace that was going to conquer the world, and so on and so forth. All right, then it collapsed. What happened? Answer, nothing. In fact, for anyone who seriously wants to understand U.S. government policy, the obvious question, the obvious documentation to look at is, what does President Bush, first President Bush, how exactly did the Bush administration respond to the collapse of the Soviet Union? Well, it turns out that there was a national security strategy that was promulgated. There was a military spending program and so on. What they said is quite interesting and almost ignored, probably because it's so interesting. What they said is that everything's going to go on exactly as before, with one change. Now it is not the Russian menace that we're defending ourselves against. We have to defend ourselves against what they call the technological sophistication of third world powers. I don't know if they laughed hysterically when they wrote that, but anyway, that's what they said. What about the military system? What they call the defense industrial base. It's a euphemism for high-tech industry. Has to be exactly as before. Nothing has to change. Now, what about our intervention forces, primarily aimed toward the Middle East? Have to stay exactly the same. And they added an interesting phrase. They still have to be aimed toward the Middle East, where the problems that might have called for military intervention could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. Nice phrase. I mean, sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now we can't lie anymore. The clouds have lifted, so the problems could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door, but we still have to have those forces there because that's the world's major energy resource, and we got to control it.
It was around this time also that Bush uttered the words, Bush #1, what we say goes, which was the title of our last book.
That's right. And it's interesting that all of this passed with almost no comment. Sure. Some did comment. So, for example, there was an interesting article by Dmitry Symes, a Russian specialist, in the New York Times, had an op-ed or something in which he said, this is right before the fall of the Berlin Wall, but when it was obvious that, he said, this is going to be great for the United States. It'll remove the constraints on our actions. we'll now be able to be much more free in our military actions everywhere. We will be able to resist the pressure of the third world countries that are oppressing us by all their demands for aid and so on. It's going to be great, you know. So fine, let's throw away all the pretenses. Let's just use the opportunity to take over the world by force and take what we want. And nobody's in our way. In fact, Elliott Abrams, this is still in the government, I think he was still in the government at the time, when Bush's first action after the fall of the Berlin Wall within weeks was to invade Panama and probably kill a couple of thousand people. Nobody knows because we don't investigate our crimes. But the Central American, Costa Rican-based Central American Human Rights Agency investigated, and I think they estimated 3,000 killed, mostly bombing the El Chorrillo slums. The Catholic bishops in Panama issued a pastoral letter condemning the bombing. I mean, Panama still observes a day of mourning, National Day of Mourning, every December. I had it last December. We never mention it here because of the invasion. They had to reshape NATO. That was an interesting development, which is very much on the front pages today.
Because of Georgia and Ukraine, the Czech Republic and Poland.
It's a military alliance. It has nothing to do with bringing the Baltic states into the EU. Austria and Finland and Sweden are in the EU, the European Union, and they're not in NATO. And the same could have been done for the Baltic states or for Hungary or Romania and so on. It was a way of expanding U.S.-run military force. In the case of the Baltic states, right to the borders of Russia. In the case of the others, close to the borders of Russia. Bush came along and extended it. The so-called Bush 2, the so-called missile defense systems, which have nothing to do with missile defense. They're understood on both sides to be essentially first-strike weapons, not as they now stand, but as they potentially might develop. They're not aimed at Iran. They're a strategic threat to Russia. Strategic analysts on the U.S. side recognize that and have written about it. Step after step was taken to show the Russians, we're just going to kick you in the face. We won. Okay, your problem. Now we're going to kick you in the face and take everything. Finally, the Russians just decided they're not going to take any more. And they put their foot down, and that's what happened in Georgia.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky on wars, bailouts, and elections. This is AR. You can order copies of this program as well as the book, What We Say Goes, by calling our toll-free number 1-800-444-1977. That's 1-800-444-1977, or you can order online on our website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org. Just to get back to U.S. Domestic issues again, you're the one principally that constantly talks about institutional structures and how they frame and inhibit actions. So realistically speaking, whichever candidate is elected, can a president make a difference?
Oh yeah, presidents make differences. In fact, over time there are systematic differences between Republicans and Democrats. So, for example, if you look over a long stretch, fairly consistently, when there's a Democratic president, there's a level of benefits for the majority of the population. Wages are a little better, benefits are a little better, and so on for the large majority. When Republicans are in office, it's the other way around. There are benefits, but for the super rich, you know. And that's a pretty consistent, same is true of civil rights and other things. It's a consistent difference. So there are differences, even though they're within a narrow spectrum. And the same is true on international affairs. There are some differences. So Reagan, for him, Russia was the evil empire. For Kennedy, it was the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. But the behavior was somewhat different. Not necessarily in Kennedy's favor, I should say, but somewhat different. And I don't doubt that there would be some difference between an Obama and a McCain presidency. In fact, the McCain presidency you can't really predict very well because he's kind of a loose cannon, but it could be pretty threatening.
What do you think of the lesser of two evils argument?
You mean that you should vote for the lesser of two evils? Well, it depends whether you care about human beings and their fate. If you care about human beings and their fate, you'll support the lesser of the two evils, not mechanically, because there are other considerations. So, for example, there could be an argument for a protest vote if it were a step towards building an alternative, a significant alternative to the choice between two factions of the business party, both of them to the right of the population on most issues. If there were such an alternative, there could be an argument either for not voting or for voting for the alternative, the third alternative. But it's a delicate judgment. On the other hand, there's nothing immoral about voting for the lesser of two evils. I mean, in a powerful system like ours, small changes can lead to big consequences. I mean, the effects that I mentioned, the long-term effects for the large majority of the population from a Democratic or Republican administration. If you care about those things, okay, you'll prefer the lesser of the two evils.
One of those institutional structures, particularly pertaining to elections, is the Electoral College, which seems to me to be inherently and by definition undemocratic. Let's say I'm running for president against you, and you win 40 states, and you have 10 million more votes than I was able to accumulate, but I win the big states, and I'm elected president. This is not talked about at all, which I find rather astonishing.
Well, actually, it is talked about by political theorists, people like Robert Dahl, Sanford Levinson, and other political theorists.
Yeah, they're in the ivory tower. I'm talking about the politicians themselves don't talk about it.
Well, basically, I think they're right, because these technical changes wouldn't affect the core issue about American elections, which is that fundamentally they don't take place. The population is not misled about this, so press won't report it, but the polls these days show, and have for a long time, that the latest ones are that about 80% of the population says the country is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, not for the benefit of the people. By latest polls I saw, about 3-1. A couple of months ago, the population criticized the campaigns because they avoid issues and keep to personalities and marginal phenomena. Public is not misled, at least so polls indicate, and those are critical facts. I mean, as compared with the fact that elections are extravaganzas essentially run by the public relations industry, with the goal of marginalizing issues and voters. As compared with that, the technical details like, do the voting machines work, or the Electoral College, just don't amount to much. Even if you fixed up those technical details, the fundamental problem would remain.
Even, say, moving elections from Tuesday, a day that people work, to the weekend, which is the case in Italy and many other, in Europe and many other countries.
Yeah, it would make some difference, perhaps, but we still would have the same fundamental problem.
Talk about the bailout of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the giant mortgage lenders, which they're called GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises. What do citizens need to know in understanding what is this bailout about, who's going to pay for it, where does the onus fall?
The people who are going to pay for it are American taxpayers. One of the major newspaper economic correspondents, Martin Wolf, good economist, writes for the Financial Times and is a believer in markets. He had a pretty strong column condemning it. He said, yes, it has to be done because of the disaster that we're in, but he said it's outrageous. First, the public is compelled to assume the risks of mortgage lending, then it's required to pay the costs when the whole system implodes. So probably there isn't any choice right now, given the nature of the disaster, but the whole system's an outrage. Why should the public have assumed the risks for financial managers? Why should we have a system who are basically unregulated? Part of the dominant ideology of the last couple of decades is that you should dismantle government regulation. Fine, so you dismantle government regulation, you have catastrophe after catastrophe. Then the public is called in to pay the costs of that ideology. It's essentially what happens. Remember, the first of them, I think it was Fannie Mae, was established in the New Deal, and it was a public entity, I think until 1968. I mean, it was part of the government. It was regulated within the government. Then the other one, if I've got that right, Freddie Mac, was set up, and they became essentially privatized, but with a government guarantee. The government guarantee simply tells the managers and investors and so on, we can play whatever game we want. The government's going to come in and save us, meaning the taxpayer will. And that's pretty much what happened. That's Milton Friedman style economics. So what's called free market economics, with the nanny state there to make sure that the public take the risks and pay the costs.
Yeah, the former Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich calls it socialized capitalism.
He does, but it's much too narrow, because that's true of just about all of capitalism. I mean, the whole high-tech economy runs that way. We've talked about that. So yes, this is an example, and it's kind of interesting to watch the outrage about it. But the same outrage should be expressed about the rest of the advanced economy as well. The financialization is a particularly egregious case, but so is pharmaceutical industry or the electronics industry.
We're speaking on the eve of September 11th, and in the 7 years since 2001, the United States has invaded and occupied two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, bombed Somalia, bombs and attacks Pakistan. Here's a headline from today's Financial Times: U.S. missiles kill 16 in attack on Pakistan's school. And the U.S. is threatening war on Iran. It's certainly conducting economic warfare. There's no question about that. And most likely covert military operations. Do you have any information about Iran and what the U.S. is doing militarily?
Well, we have the information that's being leaked from government sources to very good journalists like Cy Hirsch. And others are reported on ABC News and elsewhere. The news that's being leaked, or that some journalists in the field are picking up, is that the United States is supporting or carrying out terrorist operations, what we would call terrorist operations if someone else were doing it. They're carrying out terrorist operations either in or against Iran.
Using proxies or U.S. forces directly?
Well, let me first say we don't know that this information is correct. The information is coming from government sources, and anything that's coming from intelligence sources or unidentified diplomats and so on always should be taken with a grain of skepticism. They're not in the business of telling people the truth. They're in the business of telling people what they want them to believe. So it may be accurate, or it may be psychological warfare against Iran. But I suspect it's accurate. I mean, good reason to suspect it, on both the Iranian borders, Baluchistan, the western borders, and so on. So it's very possible that the United States is indeed supporting terrorist groups, secessionist movements, trying to disrupt Iranian society. It could well be that the information is correct. If there are, maybe there are U.S. special forces or small groups inside, but mostly it appears supporting anti-government factions. Actually, there was
like the MEK, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq.
Exactly. There's a very good reporter, Kevin McKiernan, one of the few Western journalists who's covered the Kurdish areas closely. He commented recently that there's a mountain in northern Iraq called Mount Kadil, which is way up in northern Iraq in the Kurdish areas. He says it has two sides. On one side, there are terrorists. On the other side, there are freedom fighters. They're identical, except for the fact that the terrorists are the ones who are attacking Turkey, and the freedom fighters are the ones who are attacking Iran. And the U.S., of course, supporting both of them, and they're essentially indistinguishable, except for which side of the mountain they happen to be on.
Your estimate of the likelihood of a U.S. attack on Iran before Bush leaves office or even after? And two other questions, part of that. Is Israel influencing U.S. policy on Iran? And would Israel carry out a unilateral attack on Iran?
Israel has become a pretty crazy state, one which is hard to make judgments about. There was an incredible op-ed published in the New York Times by Benny Morris, one of Israel's leading historians, in which he said essentially that Iran should welcome an Israeli bombing, because if Israel doesn't bomb them conventionally, it's going to wipe the country out with nuclear bombing. So therefore, if Israel bombs them, they should cheer. Just try to translate that into, an Iranian columnist talking about Israel, let's say. The world totally outraged. This passed quietly. He's presumably, he's making all kind of claims. So he says, we know that Iran is producing nuclear weapons. Actually, you can read that in The Nation, too. We know that Iran is producing nuclear weapons.
This is established as a fact.
That's just a fact. We refer to it, but still in The Nation they say, well, still we shouldn't bomb, we should talk. Are they developing nuclear weapons? Is the national intelligence estimate of the United States just a bunch of liars?
The December 2007 estimate, which said that Iran had stopped its program.
If they said it stopped it, in fact, never even showed that they'd had it. But maybe they are, maybe not. But the point is, it's become a fact. So it's just a fact, and then the question is, how do we stop them? It can't be that they're trying to develop nuclear energy, even though there's good reasons why they should want to do so. If you want to know why they should do so, you simply can ask Henry Kissinger, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, all of whom were strongly in favor of Iran developing nuclear energy as long as it was a U.S. ally under the Shah, and the same reasons hold. But would Israel bomb? Well, it's... I doubt that they would do it without U.S. authorization, but it's a little difficult to predict. There is a doctrine in Israel which goes back to the 1950s, which is what they call the Samson complex. Back to the 1950s, high-level officials, very high level, were saying, if anyone crosses us, we will go crazy. Ishtagea, we'll show them. We'll bring the temple walls down. American military analysts have pointed out that you can think of Israeli nuclear weapons as being aimed against the United States. Not that they're going to attack the United States, but that they might use them to get the United States into deep trouble and thereby force the United States to go along with their goals. The idea of an Iranian threat against Israel is pretty fantastic, actually. If Iran was ever to seriously threaten Israel, the country would be wiped out.
Because of overwhelming Israeli military superiority?
The United States would wipe them out in 5 minutes. It's not to say that maybe there are mad mullahs who will decide, okay, let's commit suicide. Maybe, but there's no evidence for it. And therefore, the so-called Iranian, what they mean by the Iranian threat is that Iran is supporting Hezbollah and Hamas. Well, Hamas won a democratic election, and the United States and Israel reacted instantly by crushing Palestinians for daring to vote the wrong way in a democratic election. Iran is undoubtedly supporting Hamas, so that makes them terrorists. They supported political organization that won a democratic election. Hezbollah is defending Lebanon from Israeli attack. That's a crime. How can you dare defend the country from U.S.-backed Israeli attack? So that's another terrorist act. It's not to say that Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran are nice guys. It's a separate question. But the idea of a threat has to be understood. The threat is that they are daring to stand up against the master. And that is terrorism, cannot be tolerated. And for that, they might bomb. As for the United States, I'm pretty skeptical, as I always have been, but it's conceivable. There are kind of rumbles in jingoist circles, neocon circles, that if Obama wins the election, the United States would have to bomb Iran during the lame duck period because you couldn't trust Obama to be violent enough.
Even though he and McCain both say, when it comes to Iran, the proverbial all options are on the table.
Yes, both of them insist on being in radical violation of international law and the UN Charter, which, if anybody cares, bars the threat or use of force. But both of them insist that they speak for an outlaw state, which is not bound by international law. Nevertheless, there is a difference. And, it's possible that Cheney, some others might decide to go down in a blaze of glory. Let's bomb Iran and let the chips fall where they may.
You've cited Justice Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor of the Germans at Nuremberg. He said to the tribunal to pass these defendants, talking about the Nazis in the dock, a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. What was he talking about there?
He was saying we have passed sentence on the Nazi war criminals, in fact, death sentence, and there were principles that led us to do that. We are handing them a poisoned chalice in the sense that if we carry out similar acts, we must be subject to the same judgment. If not, the trial is a farce. It's just punishment by victors, not a step towards justice. Well, we can ask ourselves, how have we dealt with that poisoned chalice? That's a question that can't be raised in the West because the answer is too incriminating.
And his chief of counsel was Telford Taylor, and he commented the main phase of the case, again against the accused Germans, is based on the assumption that it is or will be declared a punishable offense to plan and launch, and then he added, and lose an aggressive war.
Telford Taylor understood from the start, even before the tribunal, that the case for which he was one of the chief prosecutors was based on sand. He is a committed, serious, honorable person, but he recognized that there is a deep moral flaw at Nuremberg, and there was. The laws under which the crimes under which the Nazi criminals were condemned were post facto. The crimes were identified after the acts, for the most part. And he said, we're inventing them. We're inventing the crimes. But the way we're doing it is to prevent ourselves from being culpable. So as he pointed out, we are defining something as a war crime if they did it and we didn't. For example, heavy bombing of urban concentrations, the crime for which that McCain committed, that was not called a crime at Nuremberg because the Allies did it more than the Germans did. So therefore it couldn't be a crime. And he was clear about that, opposed to it, but clear about it. German war criminals were able to defend themselves successfully by bringing evidence that the Western Allies had done the same thing. The major case was German submarine commander Dönitz. He brought testimony from Admiral Nimitz, the American commander, and the British Admiralty, saying that the British and the American navies had done the same thing. He was charged for, so he was exonerated of that charge. In other words, what Taylor said in the quote you mentioned is accurate. The crime is to commit crimes and then lose a war. Same thing constantly. Take, say, the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia. There was powerful evidence brought to them by a group of international lawyers, I think mainly Canadian, calling on them to consider NATO crimes during the war. But the prosecutor, Louise Arbour, simply said, we're not going to consider this. This can't be crime. I take NATO's word for it that they didn't commit crimes. Same thing. The crime is to lose a war.
Well, I hate to remind you, but you're turning 80 on December 7th. And I wonder how things are going for you in terms of adjusting to age. And I know because of a family illness, you've really restricted your traveling and public speaking. Do you miss that? And just how are things going for Noam Chomsky?
It's one of the topics I don't talk about.
Do you miss the road travel and mixing up with people?
Yeah, I was doing it because I wanted to do it, and I thought it ought to be done. And I miss the opportunity. I miss the fact that I have to stop other things like teaching because I just don't have the time for it. But that's my personal problem.
Well, happy birthday in advance.
Thanks.
That was Noam Chomsky on wars, bailouts, and elections. I talked with him in his office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts on September 10th, 2008. Noam Chomsky has been a leading voice for peace and social justice for more than 4 decades. Author of scores of books, his latest is a collection of interviews I did with him called What We Say Goes. This program is produced by Alternative Radio, an unembedded award-winning weekly series based in Boulder, Colorado. Since we began broadcasting in 1986, we've always offered AR free to all public and community radio stations in the United States and the rest of the world. AR is independent. Our sole source of financial support comes directly from listeners just like you. AR features such voices as Gore Vidal, George Lakoff, Arundhati Roy, Tariq Ali, Naomi Klein, and Kevin Phillips. And since its inception, AR has made a special effort to record Noam Chomsky. To access our vast audio catalog, including the Chomsky Archive, and to find out about subscribing to AR so you don't miss a single program, we offer CD, printed transcript, and MP3 subscriptions. Go to our website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org. To place a credit card order for a CD, MP3, or written transcript of the program you just heard, Noam Chomsky on Wars, Bailouts, and Elections, and to order the book What We Say Goes, call us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Again, that toll-free number is 1-800-444-1977. Or you can order on our secure website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org. Series theme music is performed by the Kronos Quartet from Pieces of Africa. Ali Lightfoot is our editor. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.